For 6 weeks, I convinced myself he was just a difficult parent. Every school has one. The parent who shows up at the wrong moments with the right questions framed in the wrong tone. The one who emails at 11 at night and expects a response before morning. The one the other parents part for slightly when he walks into a room, the way water moves around a stone that has been in a river long enough to change the current. I had been teaching 4th grade for 3 years. I had navigated helicopter parents and absent parents and parents who weaponize their charm and parents who weaponize their checkbooks and one unforgettable parent who had shown up to a classroom holiday party convinced that the Christmas Carol selection was a personal slight. I knew the taxonomy. I thought I knew where he fit. His son's name was Daejin. He was 9 years old, profoundly quiet in the way of children who have learned to observe carefully before they speak, and he was the kind of student who made you love your job on the days when everything else about the job was trying to make you quit. He drew pictures in the margins of his math worksheets, not doodles, but actual small illustrations, precise and detailed, that told a story around the edges of the assignment. He had a habit of staying 2 minutes after class to put the chairs in a more organized configuration than I had managed, which he did without comment and without asking for acknowledgement, as if restoring order were simply something he did because disorder was uncomfortable. I adored Daejin. I want that to be clear before I tell you what his father put me through. His father's name was Young-soo. That was all I had for the first 3 weeks, a name on a parent contact sheet, printed in the careful handwriting of the school office manager, listed as the primary contact with a phone number and no email address and no listed employer. He attended the first parent-teacher conference alone, arrived exactly on time, sat across from me in the small chair that made most adults feel temporarily ridiculous, and looked at me with the kind of attention that made me want to check whether I'd said something wrong before I'd started speaking. I went through Daejin's work. I told him his son was one of the most perceptive children I had taught. I showed him the margin drawings. I expected the small, proud smile that most parents produce when you tell them their child is doing well. He did not produce the small, proud smile. He asked me, in a voice that was measured and completely without warmth, whether I thought Daejin was being challenged sufficiently. He asked whether the classroom curriculum accommodated different learning styles. He asked what my assessment methodology was and how I tracked progress beyond the standard grade sheet. I answered every question. He listened without reaction. At the end, he thanked me and left. For the first week, I told myself the conference had gone fine. For the second week, when the complaint emails started arriving through the school's parent portal about the reading assignment being too easy, about the group project structure being unclear, about whether I had adequate support resources for a child of Daejin's academic profile, I told myself he was simply an involved parent adjusting to a new school year. By the 6th week, when the school's assistant principal, a woman named Dorothea, called me into her office to gently relay a concern from a parent about curriculum differentiation and whether I might benefit from additional professional development, I sat in the drive home with my hands on the wheel and allowed myself, for the first time, to say the thing I had been refusing to say. He was trying to get me fired. I did not know why. I did not know what I had done, or whether I had done anything, or whether this was about me specifically or about something else entirely. What I knew was that a man whose name I had written on a contact sheet 6 weeks ago had become the central, consuming problem of my professional life, and I was running out of ways to manage it. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that there was no complaint. Not really. That the emails were a test, precise and patient, designed to measure exactly one thing, what I would do when the pressure became uncomfortable enough to break most people. He wasn't trying to get me fired. He was watching me work. My name is Ashley Wilson. I am a 4th grade teacher at Wetmore Elementary in Nashville, Tennessee. And what happened over the next 4 weeks is the most unexpected, most disorienting, and ultimately the most clarifying thing that has ever happened to me. I am going to tell you all of it. Subscribe before this goes any further. Because what Yong-soo was actually doing during those 6 weeks of complaints and conference questions is going to change every assumption you've made about this story. And you need to be here when it lands. I became a teacher the way people become the things they were always going to be, not through a single decision, but through an accumulation of smaller ones, each so natural it barely felt like choosing. I grew up in Memphis, the middle of 3 sisters. Raised by a mother who taught high school English for 31 years and a father who ran an electrical contracting business and came home every evening with the satisfied exhaustion of a man who had done something concrete and useful with his day. We were not wealthy. We were stable in the specific, sturdy way of families where stability is not taken for granted, but is built deliberately and maintained through attention. My mother graded papers at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings while my sisters and I did our homework beside her, and I absorbed, without anyone telling me to absorb it. The idea that a room full of children trying to understand something was one of the most important rooms in the world. I graduated from Tennessee State with a degree in elementary education and a minor in child development. I did my student teaching in a Title I school in North Nashville where the classroom had 17 students for reading levels, 2 broken heaters, and a teacher who showed me more about managing a room in 8 weeks than I had learned in 4 years of coursework. Her name was Celestine Oakes, and she retired the year after I observed her, and I have thought about something she said to me at least once a week since. She said, "The children who are hardest to reach are usually the ones who have decided that being reached is dangerous. Your job is to make it feel safe enough to try." I got my own classroom at 23. I have not stopped thinking about Celestine Oakes' sentence. Wetmore Elementary was not the school I had planned for. I had applied to 3 schools closer to the North Nashville community where I had done my training, wanting to stay in the environment I understood. 2 of those positions fell through due to budget decisions. The 3rd offered me a position and then rescinded it when the district reallocated the funding. Wetmore, a school in a mixed-income neighborhood on the east side of Nashville, had an opening in the fall, and an assistant principal named Dorothea who interviewed me for 40 minutes and offered the position before I had driven home. Dorothea was the reason I stayed when the 2nd year got hard and the 3rd year got harder in different ways. She was the kind of administrator who shielded her teachers from the administrative friction that made good teaching impossible, who managed parents with the specific combination of warmth and immovability that the job required, and who gave feedback in the direct, constructive manner of someone who believed that honest information was a form of respect. When Dorothea called me into her office in week 6 to relay the parent concern, she did it the way she always delivered difficult news, with context, with care, and with the quiet signal that she was not alarmed and did not think I should be either. But the concern had to be addressed because a parent had been persistent, and persistent required a response. The parent, of course, was Yong-soo. I had done nothing wrong. I knew this with the certainty you know things when you have been meticulous about your work and your documentation and your communication, and have still somehow become the subject of a complaint from a parent you cannot categorize. The complaints were not about anything specific enough to investigate. They were about tone and approach and adequacy, the soft, imprecise vocabulary of criticism that is designed to be impossible to fully defend against because there is nothing concrete enough to refute. What I did not know, sitting across from Dorothea's desk, was that Yong-soo had said this same thing to Dorothea privately that he had communicated through every indirect move over 6 weeks. He had said it clearly and without aggression. "I want to see how she handles adversity." Dorothea had not told me this at the time. She told me later, after everything had changed, and when she told me she said, "I should have told you. I didn't tell you because I thought knowing would affect the result, and he had been right about that part. But I am getting ahead of the story. Let me take you back to the beginning of week 7, when Ashley Wilson drove to school on a Monday morning with the specific, quiet resolve of a woman who has decided she is done being afraid of something she doesn't understand and is going to find out what it actually is. The complaint about the group project was the one that finally made me stop managing and start thinking. It arrived on a Thursday evening at 7:42 through the parent portal, in the same measured, impersonal tone as every previous communication. It said that the collaborative project structure I had assigned, a social studies group project where each student contributed a section of a presentation about a chosen community, was weighted toward outgoing students in a way that disadvantaged children with different communication styles, and that perhaps I should consider alternate assessment pathways. It was not wrong. It was not wrong in a way that had a clear counterargument, because differentiated assessment was a real concept in education, and the concern was the kind of thing that a thoughtful, informed person could raise in good faith. It also did not sound like it came from a parent who had spent more than 15 minutes in an elementary school classroom. It sounded like it came from someone who had been briefed, by someone who knew what critiques could not be immediately dismissed, which meant someone who understood pedagogy well enough to identify the gaps. I sat with my laptop open at my kitchen table and read the email 4 times. Then I opened my gray book and pulled up Daejeon's portfolio. Daejeon had not struggled with the group project. He had contributed more than his assigned section, had produced 3 detailed illustrations for the presentation at the group's request, and had given a portion of the verbal presentation voluntarily, unprompted, in the quiet and precise manner that characterized everything he did. His group had given the strongest presentation in the class. He was thriving by every metric I had. His father's complaint was not about Daejeon's experience. It was about something else. I opened the parent portal and looked at the communication history. 6 weeks. 11 separate messages. Every one of them had been sent between 7 p.m. and midnight, which meant they were sent after a day of whatever Young-soo did with his days. Every one of them was professionally written in a way that suggested either formal education or, more precisely, the habit of communicating in contexts where the quality of written language carried weight. I had not researched him. This is the thing I would wonder about later, why I had not, in 6 weeks of sustained professional stress caused by one specific person, thought to look him up. The answer was partly that I had been in reactive mode, managing each complaint as it came rather than stepping back to look at the pattern, and partly a kind of trained professional refusal to treat parents as adversaries even when their behavior was adversarial. You responded to what they sent you. You did not investigate them. I decided, on Thursday evening at 8:15, that the professional refusal was no longer serving me. I typed his name into the search bar. The first page of results was not what I expected. Not what any reasonable person would have expected when searching for a parent from a 4th grade class contact sheet. The name Young-soo appeared in 3 separate business publications from the previous 2 years, connected to a commercial real estate development firm headquartered in Nashville with additional operations in Atlanta and Charlotte. The firm was described in one article as one of the Southeast's fastest-growing private real estate acquisition groups. The article included a photograph. The photograph was of the man who sat across from me in the small chair at parent-teacher conferences. He was wearing a different kind of suit than the ones he wore to school events, not the careful, understated clothing I had associated with him, but something that communicated a different order of resource. He was standing in front of a building I recognized as being on the east side of Nashville, not far from Wetmore, and he was looking directly at the camera with the same quality of attention he brought to every interaction. I read the article. Then I read the second article. Then I searched his firm's name and found the third. The firm had acquired 14 commercial properties in Nashville in the previous 3 years. It had a registered portfolio valued at, according to one publication's estimate, considerably more than most things in my frame of reference for what constituted considerable. The firm's principal, Young-soo, was described in the most recent article as unusually private for a developer of this scale, a phrase that the journalist seemed to treat as mildly exotic and that I was now treating as highly relevant. Unusually private. 14 commercial properties. A school parent who sent carefully constructed pedagogical critiques after 7 p.m. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while. The question that had been forming for 6 weeks, why is he doing this, had not been answered. It had only become more pointed. He was not a man who needed to spend his evenings constructing complaints about elementary school group projects. He was not a man who lacked access to resources or alternatives if Wetmore Elementary was genuinely not meeting his son's needs. He could have moved Daejin to a private school on any given Tuesday without the decision disrupting anything in his life at a meaningful level. He hadn't. He had enrolled Daejin in my class and sent me 11 emails over 6 weeks and shown up at a parent-teacher conference in a chair designed for a 9-year-old and asked me precise questions about assessment methodology. Why? I did not sleep well that night. I went to school on Friday with the focused restlessness of a woman who has identified the correct question and is now working on the courage to ask it directly. Children tell you things. Not always in words, not always intentionally, but consistently, because children are not yet fluent in the art of concealment. They have not yet learned to manage the space between what they feel and what they show, and so what they feel tends to surface in the seams of ordinary moments, in the margin drawings and the after-class chair straightening and the small, unscripted observations they offer without fully understanding what they're offering. Daejin told me things from the first week of school. I had learned to listen to them the way you learn to read the marginalia of a book, not as the main text, but as the notes of a reader who is paying very close attention. He had mentioned his father 4 times in the first 6 weeks. Once to say that his father made breakfast every morning and did not allow cereal. Once to say that his father read every night before bed, in Korean, from actual books rather than a phone. Once, after the group project presentation, to say that he had told his father how it went and his father had asked very specific questions about what the other children had contributed and whether Daejin felt the distribution of work had been fair. The 4th time was on a Friday in week 7, which was the week after I had looked Young-soo up. I kept Daejin 2 minutes after class, not unusual, given that he regularly stayed to straighten the chairs. The other students had cleared out, and the room had the particular quiet of a classroom at 4:15 on a Friday, a quiet that feels like the building itself is exhaling. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he was enjoying the school year so far. He said yes. Then he said, with the careful precision he brought to everything, "I think my father worries about whether I am being taught well." I kept my voice exactly neutral. What makes you think that? Daejin considered the question with the seriousness he gave to everything. He asks a lot of questions about you, he said. Not about school. About you specifically. What you say and how you say it and what happens when things are difficult. I looked at him. He looked back at me with the steady, observant eyes of a child who understood more than he was saying and was giving me what he had decided was enough. Does that bother you? I asked. No, he said. And then, after a moment, my father says that how a person responds to difficulty is the most important thing about them. He says the rest is decoration. He straightened the last chair. He picked up his backpack. He said goodbye with the small, formal courtesy he always used and walked out the door. I sat at my desk for a long time after he left. How a person responds to difficulty is the most important thing about them. The sentence had the specific quality of something that had been said before, that had been decided and settled and was now being passed forward. A principle rather than an observation. The kind of thing a parent says to a child when they want the child to carry it. It also, understood in the context of 6 weeks of targeted professional pressure on the teacher of the child in question, had a different quality entirely. What I was experiencing was not a parent who hated me. What I was experiencing, I was beginning to understand, was a test. The question was what kind of test, and what it was actually measuring, and what happened when you passed it or failed it, and what kind of person designs a test like this for a 4th grade teacher, and why. I did not have answers to any of these questions yet. But the shape of them had clarified, and shape is the beginning. I went home that Friday, and I did something I had not done in 6 weeks of reacting. I made a list of every complaint, every conference question, every parent portal message, and I laid them out in sequence and looked at what they had in common. They all measured the same thing. Not my curriculum. Not my classroom management. Not my administrative compliance or my lesson plan structure. Every single communication, framed differently, aimed at different specifics, was measuring what I did when something pushed against me. Did I fold? Did I deflect? Did I over-explain? Did I get defensive in the way that erodes credibility? Did I escalate in a way that creates more friction than it resolves? Did I absorb the pressure and continue functioning? Did I find a way to address the substance without losing the thread of what I was actually doing? He had been measuring my responses under stress for 6 weeks. Systematically. With the patience of someone who had decided that 6 weeks was the appropriate sample size. The question that sat at the center of all of this, the one I could not yet answer, was why a man with a real estate portfolio and an unusual degree of privacy and a son who straightened chairs and drew margin illustrations needed to know how his 4th grade teacher responded to adversity. What was he planning to offer me? Ashley Wilson figured out she was being tested on a Friday night with a yellow legal pad and 6 weeks of printed emails. Subscribe, because what Young-soo was actually building while she was reading those emails is not what any part of the story has suggested yet. Wetmore Elementary held a fall fundraiser every year on the 2nd Saturday of November, a community event on the school grounds that combined a craft fair, a bake sale, a silent auction, and the specific organized chaos of approximately 300 children who had been told this was a fun day and had taken that information very seriously. I always volunteered for the setup shift, which started at 7 in the morning and which most staff avoided because it required 3 hours of folding tables in a parking lot before a cup of coffee that was worth drinking. I volunteered because Celestine Oakes had told me, in one of the 8 weeks I spent in her classroom, that the teachers who show up early are the ones who understand that they are part of a place, not just an employee of one. Young-soo arrived at 7:23. He was not on the volunteer list. I know because I had checked it twice in the week before the event, in the way that you monitor the schedule of something you have decided to stop avoiding. His name was not there. He had not signed up. He came anyway, without announcement, and found Dorothea near the entrance and asked where he could be useful. Dorothea pointed him toward the furniture assembly area. He spent 45 minutes setting up tables with the focused efficiency of someone who has done manual work before and does not find it beneath him. He worked alongside 2 other parents and a custodian named V.S. who had been at Wetmore for 15 years and who, I observed from across the parking lot, seemed to assess Young-soo in the first 5 minutes and then work with him without further consideration, which was the highest form of acceptance V.S. extended to anyone. I did not approach him. I was managing the classroom craft stations, and I had 3 parents asking me questions about tablecloth placement, and I kept my professional attention exactly where it needed to be. He came to me. At 9:15, during a brief lull before the event opened to the public, he appeared at the edge of the classroom craft station with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he set on the table beside me without asking if I wanted it. He stood at the appropriate distance of someone making a professional social appearance rather than a personal one. "You set up the reading stations yourself," he said. It was an observation, not a compliment, the tone of someone noting data. "The parents on that committee had other stations to manage," I said. "You could have reassigned it." "I could have." I looked at him. I didn't. He looked at the stations. I had set up 6 of them, each with a different book displayed alongside a brief card I had written explaining why I had chosen it and what a child who loved it might enjoy next. It was above what the event required. It was what I did when I had full ownership of a task. "These are good choices," he said, looking at the books. "Thank you." He picked up the card next to a well-worn paperback copy of the one and only Ivan and read it. He set it down. He looked at me with the same quality of attention he brought to every interaction, and I decided, on a Saturday morning in a parking lot with a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for, that I was done being managed by my discomfort with that attention. "Why are you doing this?" I said. He did not ask what I meant. He also did not answer immediately. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a question to be asked directly and is now deciding whether the directness has earned a direct answer. "I wanted to see how you worked," he said. For 6 weeks. For 6 weeks. The complaints were genuine concerns, framed in a way that would create professional pressure. Nothing I sent was fabricated, but none of it was the actual point. He held my gaze. No, he said. I waited. He did not continue, which told me the continuation was coming on his timeline rather than mine, and that the timeline was not here, in a school parking lot, with 300 children about to arrive and a bake sale to manage. I need to think about what you've said, I said. Because it was true, and because it was the correct response, and because I had learned, over 6 weeks, to say the true thing at the precise level of its truth rather than over-explaining or understating. Something in his expression shifted. Very slightly. The quality I had been unable to name through all the conferences and portal messages, and the corner of his mouth that never quite arrived at a smile. I know, he said. He walked back toward the entrance. He stayed for the entire event. He manned the silent auction table for 2 hours and raised more money for that table than it had raised in the previous 3 years combined, according to Dorothea, who told me this the following Monday with the specific, pleased expression of someone reporting a surprise that confirmed a theory. I spent the rest of that Saturday with the question sitting in the bottom of my chest, the way important questions sit when you know they're not finished, but you can't yet see their shape completely. What was he building? And why had he needed to watch me build for 6 weeks before he was ready to tell me? I asked Dorothea on Monday morning. Not the careful, professionally managed version of the question I had been constructing since Saturday. The direct one. I walked into her office at 7:45 before the first bell and sat down across her desk and said, "What do you know about Yong-soo that you haven't told me?" Dorothea looked at me for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a specific question and is relieved it has finally arrived. "Sit down," she said. I was already sitting. She meant it in the broader sense. She made me a cup of tea from the small kettle on her bookshelf, which she only produced in conversations that were going to take longer than 15 minutes. She sat across from me and folded her hands. "He came to see me in August," she said. "Before school started. Before Daejin was even enrolled." I stared at her. He came in for a 40-minute meeting. He wanted to know about the teaching staff, the 4th grade in particular. He asked very specific questions. Not about curriculum, not about facilities. About character. About how teachers handled difficult parents and difficult students and difficult days. She paused. I asked him why. He said he was trying to understand whether Wetmore was the right place for his son, and that the right place was about the people, not the programs. "And you told him?" "I told him about you," Dorothea said. "I told him you were the teacher on the staff I was most certain of. That you were still growing, which every good teacher always is, but that the foundation was sound and the character was there." She held her tea. "He asked me if you had ever been tested in a way that required you to hold your position under sustained pressure, and I said not in a way that had come from outside the classroom, and that maybe that was a gap." I felt something tighten in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but had elements of both. "He told you he was going to do it." "He told me he had a method," she said carefully. "He told me that the people he worked with in his professional life were placed under observation before they were offered anything, and that he extended the same consideration to the people he trusted with his son. He said it was not personal and not punitive." "Did you agree to it?" Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "I didn't stop it," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I didn't stop it because I thought you would pass, and because I thought if you did pass you deserved whatever he was going to offer you, and because I am your administrator and not your parent, and you are a professional and professionals are assessed." She looked at me steadily. "I should have told you. That's my answer to the version of this question you haven't asked yet." I sat with that for a moment. "What is he going to offer me?" "I don't know specifically," she said. "He said he had a project. Something that had to do with a school." I didn't ask more, because the details weren't what mattered to me. What mattered to me was whether Ashley Wilson was going to be standing in the right place when someone with the capacity to do something significant decided to do it near her school. I thought about Daejin straightening the chairs. I thought about the margin drawings and the morning breakfasts and the principle his father had passed to him about how people respond to difficulty. I thought about a man who had enrolled his son in my class not because he needed the school, but because he had already decided the school was where he wanted to be for the duration of whatever he was planning. And he needed to know whether the teacher in that room was the kind of person he was building for or the kind of person who would complicate the build. He was checking if I was worth it, I said. He was checking if you were real, Dorothea said. There's a difference. The first bell rang. I stood up. I picked up my bag. One more thing, Dorothea said. I paused at the door. He called me Sunday evening, after the fundraiser. She looked at me with the particular expression of a woman who knows how to hold information until the moment it lands correctly. He said he wanted to have a proper conversation with you. Not at the school. He said he had something to show you. I walked to my classroom. I went through the morning routine with the practiced steadiness of a professional who has learned that the children in front of you are the correct priority regardless of what is happening everywhere else. I taught reading. I taught math. I helped a child named Briseis understand place value through a system involving colored blocks that finally connected for her at 11:47, and the expression on her face when it clicked was the precise reason I had become a teacher. At 2 o'clock, I found a note in my school mailbox. It had an address and a time, written in the same careful hand as every parent portal message. Saturday at 10. No name, no explanation. But I knew. Ashley Wilson found a note in her school mailbox at 2 p.m. on a Monday. Young-soo gave her an address and a time and zero explanation. Subscribe, because where that address leads is the part of the story that nobody who has been following the parent complaint thread was expecting. The address was on a street I did not know well, on the east side of Nashville in a neighborhood that had been in the middle of changing for several years. The particular urban condition where buildings that have been unremarkable for decades are suddenly surrounded by new construction, and the gap between what was there and what is arriving is visible in every block. I drove there on Saturday at 9:45, which was earlier than I needed to be, and was the expression of the fact that I was not calm about this in the way I needed to appear calm about it. The building was a 4-story structure on the corner of the block. It was older, mid-century, the kind of commercial construction that had been built when buildings were expected to last and had done so through decades of varying levels of attention. The ground floor was vacant. The upper floors were accessible through a main entrance that had been recently refinished, the kind of refinishing that suggests an ongoing project rather than a completed renovation. There was a sign on the exterior. It did not carry a company name. It said, in plain letters, Wetmore Community Learning Center, coming 2025. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment. Then I went inside. The ground floor was in the middle of construction. Not rough construction. The structural work was done, and what was happening now was the interior build-out, the precise and detailed work of turning a shell into a functioning space. I could see the framing for what would be a large open room, the roughed-in positions for electrical and plumbing, the marks on the walls where built-in shelving was planned. Someone had taped a series of architectural renderings to the wall near the entrance. I walked closer and looked at them. The renderings showed a learning center, not a school in the institutional sense, but a community-centered space with a library, tutoring rooms, a maker space, an early childhood program area, and a rooftop garden on the second level that the renderings labeled as an outdoor classroom. The design was thoughtful and specific. There were children in the renderings, illustrated in the way that architectural drawings sometimes include people as figures suggesting use, but the diversity of those figures had been considered carefully. They looked, in their illustrated way, like the actual demographic of the East Nashville neighborhood they were drawn into. I was still reading the renderings when I heard footsteps behind me. Young-soo. He was in a jacket and plain trousers rather than the full professional presentation of his school appearances, and the context made him look different, not less precise, but less constructed. More like a person who was somewhere he cared about rather than somewhere he was performing within. He stood beside me and looked at the renderings without introduction or preamble, in the way of two people who have already had the conversation that establishes why they're in the same room. The neighborhood has been changing for 7 years, he said. The families who were here before the change are being compressed. The schools that serve this specific block have had 4 principals in 6 years and a 58% teacher turnover rate. The community center that was 2 blocks east closed in 2019 when the building was sold. He pointed to the maker's space in the rendering. This opens in March if the current construction schedule holds. I looked at the rendering, then at him. Why Wetmore? I asked. Because Dae-Jean's mother grew up in this neighborhood, he said. And because she died 4 years ago, and because she used to say that the east side of Nashville was the kind of place that did extraordinary things with insufficient resources for people who never got the credit for it. He looked at the rendering for a moment. I have resources. This neighborhood has been doing extraordinary things with insufficient ones for 30 years. I thought it was time for the equation to change. I held the weight of this for a moment. And Dae-Jean goes to Wetmore because it was her school, he said. Simply. She went there as a child. He goes there because she would have wanted him to know the place she came from. The room was quiet except for the sounds of the construction happening above us. I looked at the renderings. The outdoor classroom. The early childhood area. The tutoring rooms. What do you need from me? I said. He looked at me with the attention I had now spent 8 weeks learning to hold. I need an education director, he said. Someone who understands the community and the children who come from it. Someone who knows how to build a learning environment that serves actual children rather than educational theory about children. He paused. Someone who doesn't fold under pressure. Because this project will produce pressure of a kind that makes parent portal complaints look like light exercise. I thought about Celestine Oaks in a classroom with 17 students and 4 reading levels and 2 broken heaters, doing the most important work I had ever watched anyone do. Why didn't you just ask me? I said. Because I needed to know you could handle it before I offered it, he said. And I couldn't know that by asking. He looked at the building around us. I have made serious mistakes trusting people I didn't test. I have paid for those mistakes in ways that go beyond money. I don't do that anymore. I looked at the rendering one more time. At the rooftop garden that was going to be an outdoor classroom. At the children in the illustration who looked like the actual children 2 blocks from where I was standing. I need to understand the full scope, I said. I know, he said. That's why I brought you here. Not to sell you something. To show you what it is. He spent 2 hours walking me through the building and then, when I had questions the building couldn't answer, we sat at a work table in what would become the library, and he answered them with the same measured precision he brought to every communication. The project was not purely philanthropic. He wanted me to understand that clearly. The building was owned by one of his commercial entities. The renovation was being funded through a combination of private investment and a foundation he had established in his late wife's name. And the operating costs of the center would be sustained through a revenue structure that involved the upper floors remaining as commercial lease space. The ground floor, the learning center, operated as a charitable program. The building made the program financially possible without requiring it to depend on grants or public funding cycles that could be withdrawn. He had thought about this the way he thought about everything. Carefully, from multiple angles, with an eye toward the structures that failed and a deliberate effort to build around those failure points. Why not just donate to existing organizations? I asked. Because existing organizations are constrained by existing structures, he said. I have watched this neighborhood for 7 years. I have watched programs come in with the right intentions and the wrong models and collapse because they were dependent on the continued goodwill of funders who had other priorities. I am trying to build something that doesn't collapse when the goodwill changes, because the goodwill always changes eventually. I thought about the 4 principals in 6 years. The 58% teacher turnover. What's driving the teacher attrition in this zone? He looked at me as if this were the first question that confirmed something he had been waiting to have confirmed. Inadequate support structures and compensation that doesn't reflect the difficulty of the work, he said. Teachers who are doing the hardest kind of teaching in the most under-resourced environments are paid identically to teachers in easier environments. The people who should be receiving the most stay the least amount of time because they have no reason to. And the center would offer supplementary programs that support what the schools are trying to do, not replace them, extend them. Tutoring during hours schools can't cover. After-school enrichment that doesn't require parents to pay for private programs. A library that's actually open when families need it to be open. He paused. And an education director who understands what this community's children actually need, as opposed to what a model says they should need. I thought about Briseis and the colored blocks and the expression on her face at 11:47 when place value finally made sense. I thought about the children in Celestine Oakes's classroom and what it meant to have a teacher who understood that reaching them was the work and everything else was in service of that. Tell me what you know about me, I said. From the 6 weeks. What did you learn? He considered the question seriously, which I had come to understand was the only way he considered anything. You absorb pressure without deflecting it, he said. You respond to criticism by examining whether it contains something useful before deciding whether it doesn't. You don't take shortcuts visible to others when you think no one is measuring the shortcut. You delivered reading stations at a community event that required more of you than the task technically required, and you did it without making it a performance. You tell children the true thing at the precise level of its truth. He paused. And when Daejin told you something that gave you information you needed, you sat with it rather than acted on it immediately. That was the one I was least certain about in advance. I looked at him. Daejin knew he was telling me something useful. Daejin is 9 years old and very perceptive, he said. He made his own assessment of you in the first week and began doing his own version of advocacy approximately 3 weeks ago. I did not ask him to. Something moved in my chest, not quite surprise, because I had known Daejin was perceptive, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a child who had watched his father test someone and had quietly, on his own schedule, decided which side of the verdict he was on. He's a remarkable kid, I said. He is, Young-soo said. And for the first time in 8 weeks of interactions, the expression was simple and uncomplicated. The expression of a father saying something true. We were quiet for a moment. Outside the work table windows, the construction sounds on the floor above had stopped for the day. There's something else, he said. I waited. The work I do, he said. My primary business. It is real estate development. That is accurate and documented and entirely legitimate. But you will find, if you continue to research my name, that there are things associated with it that are more complicated than a commercial property portfolio. I looked at him. Tell me. He was quiet for a moment. Not avoiding, deciding how to be accurate. I come from a family with a particular history, he said. A history that is not mine currently in an operational sense, but that I was inside for years before I built a way out of it. The way out took a long time and cost more than I am going to describe today. I am telling you because you will find it and because finding it without context would be a different kind of discovery than finding it with me having told you first. I held this, the specific weight of it, the information and the decision to give it to me before I asked, which was the decision of someone who had decided I was not a risk to manage, but a person to be honest with. Is Daejin safe? I asked. Because it was the first question. Yes, he said. Without qualification. Are you? He looked at me. More than I have been, he said. And moving in the right direction. I sat with the answer for a long moment. Then I looked at the architectural rendering on the wall, the rooftop garden, the children in the illustration, the library that would be open when families needed it to be open. Tell me what the education director role actually requires, I said. Young-soo just told Ashley Wilson about his family history before she could find it herself. Subscribe, because the reason he told her first, and the reason she stayed at that table to hear the rest of it, is the part of the story that explains every single thing that came before it. I told Dorothea on Monday. Not the full version, not the family history, which was Young-soo's to give on his own schedule to whoever had earned it, but the structure of what he was building and what he had offered and what I was seriously considering. I sat across her desk and told her the way I had learned, over 8 weeks, to tell things, at the precise level of their truth, without inflation or management. Dorothea listened. She did not react with surprise, which confirmed that she had known more of the shape of this than she had shared with me and had made the same calculation she had made in August, that the result was better earned than given. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I'm going to look into everything he told me to look into and make the decision with complete information." She nodded. "That sounds right." I went home that evening and I did what he had told me I would do. I looked. The name Yong-soo, searched beyond the commercial real estate publications, produced results that were harder to categorize. Peripheral associations with investigations that had been opened and closed. A connection to a family name that appeared in several Korean-language news articles I had to translate. Articles that described a criminal organization with a history spanning 3 decades and a current status that was, according to the most recent English-language reference I found, significantly diminished following the death of its former leadership and a series of federal investigations in the mid-2010s. The former leadership had been his father. I read everything I could find for 2 hours. Then I sat with the specific complexity of what I had read and what I knew about the man who had sat across from me in a building on the east side of Nashville and told me about his late wife's neighborhood and the rooftop garden and the meaning of building something that doesn't collapse when the goodwill changes. I was not naive about what this meant. I had not spent 2 hours reading, so I could decide the information wasn't significant. It was significant. The family history he had described as complicated was considerably more specific than complicated, and the category of organization his family had been involved in was not one that existed in a morally neutral space. What I held alongside this was something equally specific. He had told me first. He had told me before I asked, before I could discover it and return to him with it as a challenge. He had told me the way you tell someone something you know they have the right to decide about, not to manage their reaction, but because you have decided they are owed the full information and should make the choice with their eyes open. He had spent 3 years building a legitimate real estate portfolio. He had spent 4 years building a foundation in his late wife's name. He had spent 7 years watching a neighborhood and understanding what it needed and constructing something that had a revenue model that didn't depend on goodwill because he had learned, in whatever way he had learned things, that goodwill was the wrong foundation for anything you were building to last. He was not the organization his father had led. He was a man who had come from it and built an exit that most people in that position did not manage and had directed what he had taken from it towards something that Celestine Oaks, if she were alive and teaching in East Nashville today, would have recognized immediately. Was that enough? That was the question. Not whether the history was real, it was. Not whether it was complicated, it was. Whether the man building the rooftop garden was the version of himself that he had decided to be, and whether that decision had been sustained over enough years with enough consistency to be the version you could trust with something that mattered. I thought about Dae-jin. About a father who made breakfast every morning and read Korean books at night, and sent his son to his late wife's school and sat in small chairs and asked about assessment methodology and built a community center on the block where she had grown up. I thought about what it meant to test a person for 6 weeks before trusting them with something that mattered. I thought about how that principle, applied systematically, was not manipulative but was in fact the most honest version of due diligence available, more honest than references and interviews and the surface performance of professional assessment, because it showed you what a person actually did rather than what they said they would do. He had tested me because the thing he was building was worth testing for. I called him on Tuesday evening. "I found it," I said. "I know," he said. "I have questions." "I know that too." "I'm going to ask them," I said. "All of them. And I need you to answer them the way you told Dae-jin things get answered, at the precise level of their truth." A pause. Then, "That's fair." "Good," I said. "I'll come Saturday." We talked for 4 hours on Saturday. I asked every question I had written down over the previous 5 days, and some that I hadn't written down but that surfaced in the conversation in the way that the real questions sometimes do, not prepared, but inevitable. He answered all of them with the same quality he brought to everything, measured, complete, without softening the difficult parts into something easier to hear. He told me about his father. About growing up inside something you understand from the inside differently than the outside, the specific moral complexity of loving a person who is also a system you cannot endorse and cannot separate from the person. He told me about the years he spent trying to separate himself cleanly and the ways that clean separation is rarely available to people in that position, and the work, legal, financial, personal, of building enough legitimate distance that the distance became structural rather than just claimed. He told me his late wife, Soo-yoon, had known who his family was from the beginning. That she had made her own assessment, the way she made all her assessments, quietly, over time, with patience for the full picture rather than the first impression. She had decided he was not his father. She had decided this, he said, before he was fully certain of it himself, and that her certainty had been one of the things that made it possible to get there. She sounds extraordinary, I said. She was the most precise person I have ever known, he said. And something in his voice, when he said it, was simple the way Dae-jin was simple when he described his father, unguarded, without any of the careful construction he maintained everywhere else. I understood, then, the full shape of the 6 weeks. Why he had needed to know I could handle pressure. Why Dae-jin's assessment had mattered to him. Why he had built the test around what Soo-yoon had believed was the most important thing about a person, not their credentials, not their performance in optimal conditions, but what they did when difficulty arrived and staying was harder than leaving. He had been looking for someone she would have trusted. And he had used the principle she had used to identify those people: patience, observation, the willingness to let the test run long enough to be meaningful. The education director position, I said. Tell me exactly what it requires. He told me. It was substantial. The scope of the role was significantly larger than anything my title at Wetmore had prepared me for, not because of the prestige, but because of the complexity. Managing the programming, building relationships with the school district, coordinating with the commercial tenants above whose lease revenue sustained the operation, representing the center to the community and the foundation and the board he was assembling. I've never done anything like this, I said. I know, he said. I'm not looking for someone who has done it. I'm looking for someone who will build it correctly because they understand what it's for. I looked at the table between us. You could hire someone with 10 years of nonprofit leadership experience and a track record in education administration. I could, he said. I have met several of them. They know how to operate systems that are already functioning. This system doesn't exist yet. Building it requires a different kind of person than operating it. I thought about what Celestine Oaks had built in a classroom with 4 reading levels and 2 broken heaters. About what it meant to start from where things actually were rather than where models said they should be. I need to stay at Wetmore through the end of the school year, I said. Dae-jin finishes 4th grade. My class finishes with me. He nodded immediately. The center opens in March. You would transition in the summer. I need a proper contract. Terms that are clear and written and legal. Of course. And I need to be able to do this work without navigating anything connected to the history you described. Not because I'm asking you to lie to me about what exists. Because if I'm running a children's learning center, it needs to stand entirely on its own ground. He looked at me with an expression I could read now, after 8 weeks, with some accuracy. Respect was part of it. Something else underneath. That's why I chose you, he said. You've identified the correct boundary without me having to negotiate it. That's the thing I couldn't have found by asking. I sat with everything for a moment. Outside the windows of the building, the east side of Nashville was doing what it had been doing for 30 years, getting up in the morning, sending its children to school, building what it could with what it had. Doing extraordinary things with insufficient resources in ways that never quite got the credit they deserved. Tell me about Soo-yoon, I said. The work she wanted to do for this neighborhood. Tell me what she actually imagined. He was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, he began to talk about his wife. about what she had believed about the children she had grown up with in this neighborhood and what they deserved and what it would take to provide it. He talked for a long time, and it was the least measured version of himself I had heard, not constructed, not tested, just present in the way of someone describing something they have been carrying and are finally putting down in a place they trust. I listened the way Celestine Oakes had taught me to listen, not just to the words, but to what the words were carrying. I understood, by the time he finished, what I was being asked to build. Not a program. Not an institution. A continuation. Something that had begun with a woman from this neighborhood who believed her community deserved more and had been held in the hands of the man she had trusted and was now being extended to someone who had proven she would carry it correctly. When I left the building that Saturday, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the structure. At the sign that said Wetmore Community Learning Center, coming 2025. At the floors above it where the construction sounds had stopped for the weekend, and the building was quiet in the particular way of things that are almost finished becoming what they were always meant to be. I thought about Dejin's straightening chairs in my classroom at 4:15 on Fridays. About the margin drawings. About the way he had told me, with the careful precision of his father, that how a person responds to difficulty was the most important thing about them. He had been passing me a message. Not from himself, from the two people who had shaped him. A principle that was his father's and his mother's both, carried forward by a 9-year-old boy who had made his own assessment in the first week and had been patient enough to let the test finish before he showed his hand. I had one more conversation with Young-soo before I signed the contract. Dejin knew what you were doing, I said. He was rooting for me. Something changed in Young-soo's face. Not the almost smile I had learned to watch for. The actual one. He told me in week 3 that you were the right person, he said. He said the way you listened to the children told him everything he needed to know. And you waited 3 more weeks anyway. He's 9, he said. His assessments are excellent. But I needed to be certain. I signed the contract in April. I finished the school year at Wetmore with my class, with Dejin in the front row where he had always been, drawing margin illustrations and straightening chairs and asking questions that were more precise than most adults asked. We had a proper end-of-year celebration, and I told my students what I always told them at the close of a year, that what they had learned was not mine to give back, that it lived in them now, and that all I had ever been was a room that was safe enough to try in. At the summer transition, Dorothea walked me to my car and hugged me the way Celestine Oakes had hugged me on the last day of student teaching, with the specific warmth of a woman who has watched someone become the next version of themselves and is satisfied. Do something extraordinary, she said. I'm trying, I said. The Wetmore Community Learning Center opened its doors in September, 2 months behind the original March schedule because construction schedules are optimistic by nature and buildings do not hurry. The first week saw 112 children come through the programs. By October, there were over 200. Dejin came in on a Thursday after school and sat in the library and did his homework at one of the tables and then, without being asked, began organizing the returned books into their correct shelf positions. I watched him from the doorway for a moment. He looked up. He gave me the small, formal greeting he had always given me. Then he looked at the shelves and looked back at me. It's good, he said. I thought about how much that sentence carried. From a boy who had watched his mother's neighborhood his whole life, who had carried her belief in it inside a father who was building her vision, who had assessed his teacher in week 1 and waited 8 weeks to let her know his verdict. Thank you, I said. He went back to his homework. I went back to the work of building something that would last. It was exactly where I was supposed to be. The end. From a parent portal complaint at 11 p.m. to a community center that opened with 200 children in its first month. Ashley Wilson's story proves that the hardest professional seasons of your life are sometimes the ones someone else is watching most carefully. Young-soo spent 6 weeks testing what most people take years to notice. He found a teacher who responded to difficulty the way his wife had taught him a person worth trusting always does, by doing the work correctly regardless of whether anyone was measuring it. Dejin knew in week 1. His father needed 8 more weeks to be certain. Ashley Wilson spent the whole time showing up. Hit subscribe for our next story. A hospital administrator discovers that the anonymous donor who funded the new children's wing is the same man whose insurance fraud forced her sister's medical practice to close. She has one gala and 48 hours to decide what she... Real talk. When Ashley found out Yongsoo's family history, and he had already told her before she found it, did that change your opinion of him? Or had he already earned the benefit of the doubt? A. It changed everything. That history is too significant to look past regardless of what he built after B. He earned it. 3 years of legitimate work, a foundation in his late wife's name, and a children's center isn't decoration. C. Daejin knew in week 1, and I trust Daejin more than I trust any adult in this story. D. None of that matters, because a man who builds a rooftop garden classroom in his late wife's childhood neighborhood and tests the teacher who will run it for 6 weeks to make sure she's good enough is the most deliberate form of love I have encountered in a long time. Drop your answer below. And tell us, have you ever been tested by someone without knowing it? And looking back, were you glad they did it, or did it change how you felt about them? Also, Ashley stayed through the end of the school year to finish with her class before transitioning. Was that professionalism, loyalty, or just the right thing, and is there a difference? Sound off in the comments. Because this story is about something very specific, the people who build things for the right reasons, and the other people who have to be brave enough to recognize those reasons correctly before they walk through the door. What do you think?